The morning sun reflected sharply off the glass windows of the city's tallest buildings, making the streets below glimmer like a sea of gold. Among the crowd of busy people rushing to their offices, one figure stood out, a man whose very presence seemed to demand attention. He was Alexander Hale, a billionaire whose name was known across the country for his massive business empire, his unmatched wealth, and his almost legendary collection of luxury cars. Today, he was about to leave his office, and everyone around knew it. News of his arrival had spread through social media and local news outlets hours earlier, and now, cameras, journalists, and even casual onlookers had gathered outside his corporate headquarters, eager to catch a glimpse of the man who lived a life many only dreamed about. As Alexander stepped out of the towering building, the first thing anyone noticed was the line of cars waiting for him. There were sleek black sedans, shiny sports cars, and even a limited edition electric vehicle that was rumored to cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Each car was polished to perfection, reflecting the bright morning light. The fleet wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a carefully organized statement of power, control, and status. Drivers stood beside each car, their posture straight, eyes alert, hands perfectly folded, ready to obey every instruction. The hum of the engines added to the dramatic atmosphere, like a symphony of precision machines waiting for their conductor. Alexander himself was dressed immaculately, as he always was. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, and his shoes gleamed with a polish that spoke of careful attention to detail. A designer watch peeked out from under his cuff, quietly signaling that every second of his life was measured and purposeful. But despite his imposing appearance, there was a calmness about him, a quiet confidence that made people instinctively respect, or even fear, his presence. He walked with long, deliberate strides, scanning the crowd just enough to acknowledge their existence but not enough to let them feel like they mattered to him personally. After all, he had learned long ago that being powerful often meant keeping others at a distance. Security personnel flanked him on either side, forming a moving barrier between him and the crowd. They were tall, strong, and alert, scanning every person for the slightest sign of danger. Their presence reminded everyone that Alexander's life was not just about luxury and success, it was also about vigilance. Wealth brought freedom, but it also brought risks. The city might admire a billionaire, but it also tempted those who might take advantage of him. Every gesture, every movement, every step he took was protected with precision. The security team moved almost invisibly, blending into the scene while maintaining absolute control. As he approached his cars, a few photographers tried to push forward to get a perfect shot. Their cameras clicked rapidly, capturing images of Alexander with his fleet, images that would be shared, liked, and commented on endlessly. Social media buzzed with posts speculating about which car he would choose today, how much it cost, and what message it was meant to send. To the billionaire, this attention was routine. He was used to the glare of cameras, the whispers of gossip, and the constant fascination of people who wanted to know about his life. Yet he remained unbothered, almost serene, moving as though the world around him existed only in the background, while he alone had purpose and direction. Even among all the spectacle, Alexander's arrival was not just about showing off. Every detail, every car, every security measure, and every polished surface was a reflection of his philosophy. To him, organization, appearance, and control were as important as profit. His wealth was not simply a number in a bank account, it was an extension of his identity, a visible proof of his discipline and vision. People often assumed that someone with so much money would be careless, indulgent, or arrogant, but Alexander had spent years perfecting the balance between power and precision. Every movement, every glance, and even every step was calculated to maintain the image of someone untouchable, yet deeply respected. As he reached the first car, the crowd instinctively hushed, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. Alexander paused for a moment, glancing at the line of vehicles, his eyes scanning each one. It was a routine act, yet it carried weight. The choice of car was not merely about preference, it reflected mood, strategy, and purpose. Today, like every day, the cars were ready to carry him, but they also symbolized the world he had built, one of precision, influence, and unimaginable wealth. The crowd watched, breathless, fully aware that for them, this moment was a rare glimpse into a life almost impossible to imagine, a life ruled by success and controlled chaos, all wrapped in an aura of authority. Just as Alexander Hale was about to step into his sleek black sports car, something completely unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a small hand shot out and grabbed the sleeve of his perfectly tailored jacket. The sudden pull caught him completely off guard. For a billionaire who had spent decades moving through the world with caution, control, and meticulous planning, this moment was like a splash of ice-cold water on a quiet morning. His eyes widened slightly, and he instinctively froze, unsure whether this was a prank, a threat, or some form of desperate plea. The security guards reacted immediately, moving in with synchronized precision. Their strong arms reached toward the girl, ready to remove her from the scene. Their faces were tense, alert, and serious. This was not something they expected. Alexander, however, held up a hand, stopping them mid-step. He wanted to see what was happening before anyone made a rash decision. After all, he was a man who had built empires, negotiated with politicians, and survived the cutthroat world of business. Yet here he was, completely unprepared for the unexpected determination of a small child. The girl, no older than 10, looked up at him with eyes that were wide, dark, and shining with an unusual mixture of fear and courage. Her clothes were tattered and worn, shoes scuffed from long days of walking, yet there was a certain strength in the way she stood, holding on to his sleeve with surprising firmness. Her hair fell messily around her face, tied with a ribbon that had long faded in color. She wasn't begging for money, she wasn't crying, she wasn't shouting. She just looked at him directly, as though she had something important to say, and she expected him to listen. For a few tense seconds, the world seemed to pause. The photographers froze, the crowd leaned forward, and the hum of the luxury cars faded into silence. Even the guards stopped moving, unsure how to handle a situation that was completely outside their training. Alexander could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no ordinary interruption. This was something different. Something that demanded attention. He bent slightly to look at her, trying to understand what a small girl could possibly want from someone like him. He noticed the dirt on her hands, the faint marks on her arms, and the way she clutched something small tightly against her chest. That small gesture, so simple and human, created an unspoken tension in the air. Everyone around sensed it. The billionaire who commanded the city's attention was now in a rare position of uncertainty. "Wait," the girl said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the silence like a sharp arrow. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange authority, as if she knew that what she was holding was far more important than his wealth, his fame, or his carefully constructed image. Her eyes did not waver. She was not intimidated by the crowd, the cameras, or even the towering figure of Alexander himself. The billionaire's mind raced. Who was she? What did she want? Why would a child risk approaching someone so powerful in such a public place? He had encountered people asking for handouts before, people pretending to be in need to gain attention, but there was something entirely different about this girl. Her presence was pure, uncalculated, and strangely honest. It was almost impossible not to be drawn to her. Alexander looked around at his fleet of cars, at the polished lines and gleaming surfaces, and realized that none of this mattered in this moment. Money, power, and luxury could not explain or control this small, unexpected encounter. The child had introduced an element he had not encountered in years: surprise, unpredictability, and a raw, unfiltered version of human courage. As the second stretched, the girl finally extended her small hand, revealing a worn wallet. Alexander's eyes flicked to it, and for the first time that morning, his heart skipped. This wallet belonged to him. Somehow, it had slipped from his pocket unnoticed, and in those brief seconds, he had been completely unaware of its loss. Yet here was this child, chasing him down, returning what was rightfully his, without hesitation, without thought of reward. In that instant, the mood shifted. The irritation that had been rising in Alexander's chest melted into disbelief. The crowd held its breath, witnessing a billionaire humbled not by scandal, not by misfortune, but by the honesty of a poor child who had risked everything for something that did not belong to her. 5 seconds, just 5 seconds, had passed, and in those moments, the world he knew, the careful life he had built, and even his sense of control had been quietly disrupted by someone he would never have expected. The encounter was brief, yet its impact was undeniable. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The bustling city noises, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, even the hum of the luxury engines, faded into the background. All that remained was a small girl gripping the sleeve of Alexander Hale's suit and the billionaire staring down at her, caught completely off guard. Those 5 seconds stretched longer than a minute, charged with tension, curiosity, and something almost magical. Security guards instinctively moved forward again, but Alexander's raised hand froze them. He didn't want them to take her away, not yet. Something about her presence demanded that he pay attention. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, only a quiet determination. It was rare, almost unheard of, for someone, let alone a child, to approach him so boldly in public. The girl's grip on his jacket didn't waver. She wasn't pulling aggressively, but firmly enough to make him realize she wasn't about to let go until he acknowledged her. Alexander's mind raced. What was this child doing? Why had she risked approaching him in a crowd filled with cameras, reporters, and security? He had faced business rivals, hostile negotiations, and even threats to his life, but nothing had ever made him feel so uncertain, so exposed, in the middle of the street. Around them, the crowd murmured. People whispered to one another, curious and confused. Some reporters tried to push closer for a better shot, but the air around the pair seemed almost sacred, protected by the intensity of the moment. The world waited silently, holding its breath, as if sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Alexander's eyes shifted to the small object the girl held close to her chest. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but as the seconds passed, he realized what it was. His wallet, his expensive, leather-bound wallet, had slipped out of his jacket without him noticing. Inside were not just cash and cards, but personal papers, identification, and even a photograph he kept of his late mother. A sudden rush of disbelief, admiration, and relief hit him all at once. The girl, sensing his attention, extended the wallet toward him. Her small hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of responsibility. She could have ignored it. She could have run away, taken it, or handed it to someone else. Instead, she had chosen honesty, courage, and integrity, values so rare that they startled him more than any business deal or power move ever could. In those tense 5 seconds, Alexander experienced something he hadn't in years. The sense of control he had meticulously built around himself, the careful schedules, the security protocols, the polished appearances, and the calculated interactions, suddenly felt fragile. This small, determined child had disrupted his perfect world in a way no one else ever had. The power he carried in the form of wealth and influence was meaningless compared to the human courage standing in front of him. He finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with surprise. "Where did you find this?" The girl didn't hesitate. "It fell when you were talking to the reporters," she said simply, her words clear and honest. There was no hint of expectation, no plea for reward. She had acted purely because it was the right thing to do. Her gaze met his, unwavering and honest, and in that moment, Alexander felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: humility. The crowd seemed to lean in, sensing the extraordinary sincerity of the encounter. The cameras continued to click, but even the photographers felt the weight of what was happening. This wasn't about wealth, fame, or celebrity. It wasn't a staged moment. It was real, raw, and profoundly human. Alexander's eyes softened. He realized that the child had done something far more valuable than returning a wallet. She had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten in the years of building empires: integrity, honesty, and the simple, quiet courage to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. In that brief, stretched moment, both of them stood still. He, a man who controlled millions and wielded unimaginable power, and she, a poor child with nothing to gain except the satisfaction of doing what was right. 5 seconds had passed, and yet they felt like an eternity, a turning point, a moment that would linger in Alexander's mind far longer than any meeting, contract, or press conference ever could. As he reached for the wallet, he felt a strange mixture of awe, gratitude, and disbelief. Those 5 seconds had changed the energy around him completely. Something small had disrupted the world of a billionaire, something honest, fearless, and pure. And as the first hand touched the wallet, the second hand of fate seemed to shift, hinting that this encounter, fleeting though it was, would mark the beginning of something much larger, much deeper, and far more meaningful than anyone standing there could yet imagine. As the small girl held out the wallet, Alexander Hale leaned forward, his curiosity sharper than ever. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath. Everyone expected a simple transaction: he would take the wallet, thank the child, and move on. But what happened next would leave him, and everyone watching, completely stunned. The wallet, worn and scuffed around the edges, looked unremarkable at first glance. Yet Alexander knew immediately that this was no ordinary item. Inside were his personal belongings, cash, credit cards, and identification, all intact, but there was something else that caught his attention. A small, folded photograph peeked out from one of the compartments. He recognized it instantly. It was a picture of him as a child with his late mother, her smile radiant, her hands wrapped around his tiny shoulders. He had carried it in that wallet for years, a private memento of the woman who had raised him after his father passed away. For a moment, Alexander froze. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt: this little girl, poor and unnoticed by the world, had run across a crowded street, ignored the cameras and the bustling crowd, and brought back something deeply personal to a man she had never met. She could have left it, taken it, or handed it over to someone else. But she hadn't. She had returned it with pure honesty. The child's eyes met his. There was no pride in her expression, no expectation of reward. Only honesty, courage, and a quiet determination. It was rare, so rare that Alexander felt an unfamiliar tug at his chest. The kind of tug he hadn't felt in years, the kind that reminded him of what truly mattered in life, far beyond money, cars, or fame. "What, how did you know?" Alexander asked, his voice unusually soft. He realized he wasn't just shocked, he was deeply moved. The little girl had not only returned the wallet, but she had also given him something far more valuable, a reminder of his own humanity. The crowd around them was buzzing quietly now, whispers spreading like wildfire. People were recording, watching, and talking, but none of that seemed to matter. The energy in the air had shifted. The billionaire, known for his unshakable control and composure, had been humbled by a child who had nothing yet showed more integrity than most adults he had ever met. Alexander slowly reached for the wallet, his hand steady but his mind racing. The small fingers of the girl tightened slightly on the edge, as if to make sure he didn't take it without acknowledgement. He opened it and carefully inspected each compartment, making sure everything was still intact. Cash, cards, and IDs were all exactly as he had left them. But the photograph, the tiny memory of his past, was untouched. He felt a wave of gratitude and disbelief wash over him. The girl's simplicity and courage struck him harder than any business strategy, negotiation, or calculated move ever could. Here was someone with no power, no status, and no influence, yet she had done something more meaningful than any contract he had signed or deal he had closed in his entire life. She had reminded him that honesty, kindness, and courage could still exist in a world obsessed with wealth and power. "Why did you do this?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious, almost afraid of the answer. The girl paused, her gaze steady, and said simply, "Because it's the right thing to do." Her voice was calm, confident, and matter-of-fact, as though there were no other option in the world. Those words, so small yet so powerful, hung in the air like a lesson too important to ignore. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something shift within him. All the money, all the cars, all the influence, it felt hollow in comparison to this small act of honesty. He had been living a life measured in power and luxury, but in that single moment, he realized that true value wasn't in what you owned, it was in what you did when no one was watching, and in the courage to do what's right even when it's inconvenient. The crowd, sensing the rare vulnerability in the billionaire, began to whisper more loudly, yet no one dared interrupt. Cameras continued to click, but the story unfolding before them was more than a photo op, it was a lesson in humanity. Alexander had been humbled, shocked, and awakened all within a few seconds, and he knew deep down that this moment would stay with him forever. The wallet was returned, yes, but something far greater had changed. 5 seconds had revealed a truth Alexander had almost forgotten: wealth could buy anything, except integrity, courage, and the simple power of a kind heart. And standing before him, the little girl, poor but honest, had given him all three. Alexander Hale stood frozen for a moment, the wallet safely back in his hand, yet his mind and heart were racing in ways that money, power, and luxury had never caused. He looked at the girl once again, really looked at her, not the tattered clothes, not the scuffed shoes, not the small frame, but the courage, honesty, and integrity shining in her eyes. Something deep inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: awe, humility, and an almost painful awareness of how disconnected he had become from the simple truths of life. For decades, Alexander had measured the world in terms of wealth, success, and influence. He had built empires, made deals worth millions, and controlled industries. But in that instant, a 10-year-old girl with nothing had taught him a lesson far more valuable than any business negotiation. His empire of cars, buildings, and money suddenly seemed hollow compared to the integrity displayed by someone who owned almost nothing. He noticed the way she stood, calm and unassuming, yet unafraid. Her small hand had returned his wallet without hesitation. She hadn't even asked for a reward. There was no expectation, no desire for fame or recognition, just a simple, unwavering commitment to do what was right. And that simplicity, that purity of action, hit him harder than anything he had ever encountered in the boardroom. Alexander felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he considered not the deals he had closed, the money he had earned, or the power he commanded, but the kind of person he had become. Had he been too focused on wealth to notice the people around him? Too absorbed in success to recognize honesty, courage, and kindness? These questions, simple yet profound, echoed in his mind as he stared at the girl who had dared to interrupt his perfect, controlled world. He knelt slightly, an instinctive gesture he rarely made in public. It wasn't a bow of submission, nor an act of weakness, it was a silent acknowledgement of something greater than money, greater than power, and greater than himself. The child, Lena, seemed unbothered by his sudden movement. She simply held his gaze, her eyes steady, as though she already knew that he was beginning to understand something he had long forgotten. Alexander opened the wallet again, slowly, almost reverently. He checked that the cash was still there, the cards in place, and the photo of his late mother untouched. It was more than just a wallet, it was a symbol, a reminder of where he had come from, of the values his mother had taught him, and of the simple truth that life was about honesty, kindness, and integrity, not just accumulation of wealth. A quiet realization settled over him: he had been living a life disconnected from these truths. Surrounded by opulence, he had often ignored the small, human moments that gave life meaning. And yet, in just 5 seconds, a small, poor girl had reminded him of everything he had lost sight of. The shock of it was overwhelming, but it was also enlightening. He could feel the tension drain from his body. His usual composure, the armor of power he wore so carefully, softened. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel gratitude, not for money, not for status, but for this moment, this small, unexpected encounter that had shaken him to his core. The billionaire who had always controlled everything now realized that the most important things in life, honesty, courage, and human connection, could not be bought or manipulated. Alexander's eyes lingered on Lena. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly, almost to himself. "You didn't even know me." She shrugged lightly, her expression calm. "It's the right thing to do," she replied simply, as if it were obvious. Her words, simple yet powerful, echoed in his mind. They were not just words, they were a mirror, reflecting back to him the values he had once held and almost forgotten. The crowd around them continued to watch, cameras flashing, but Alexander barely noticed. In that moment, everything else, the noise, the spectacle, the flashing lights, faded away. All that remained was the emotional truth of what had just happened. He realized that wealth could buy anything except the lessons this child had taught him. 5 seconds had been enough to awaken something in him that he had long ignored. Alexander took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of humility, awe, and determination. He knew this was more than a fleeting encounter, it was a turning point, a moment that would change how he saw the world, and perhaps even how he would live the rest of his life. Alexander Hale stood still for a moment, holding the returned wallet, his mind spinning with the weight of what had just happened. The little girl, Lena, looked back at him with quiet patience, as though she understood that this was no ordinary interaction. The world around them, cameras, reporters, and the buzzing crowd, seemed to fade into insignificance. For Alexander, the moment was no longer about lost property or public appearances. He wanted to know more about her. "Tell me about yourself," Alexander said, his voice calm but filled with genuine curiosity. It was unusual for him to speak like this in public. Normally, words were calculated, measured, and controlled. But now, his interest was personal, human, and raw. Lena hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "My name is Lena," she said softly. "I live with my grandmother. We don't have much, but we have each other." Her voice carried quiet strength, but also a hint of vulnerability. Alexander noticed how her hands fidgeted slightly, as if she were unaccustomed to being asked questions by someone who could change her life with a single word. He knelt down slightly to meet her gaze. "You didn't have to chase me or give this back." "Why did you?" he asked, referring not just to the wallet, but to the courage it took to confront him. Lena shrugged again, but there was a seriousness in her expression that made him pause. "My grandmother says that honesty is everything," she explained. "If you take something that isn't yours, you lose more than money. You lose respect, and sometimes, you lose yourself." Her words were simple, yet they carried a wisdom far beyond her years. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. Here was a child, living in poverty, whose life had already taught her lessons that many adults spent a lifetime learning too late. He looked beyond her at the crowd, at the cameras, and felt the absurdity of it all. Here he was, a man with millions, surrounded by the world's attention, humbled by someone who had almost nothing. The contrast was stark, almost painful. The realization struck him, no amount of wealth or influence could replicate the strength of character he was seeing in this young girl. "Where exactly do you live?" he asked gently. Lena's eyes flickered toward a distant alley behind the building. "Not far from here," she said. "We rent a small room. My grandmother works all day, and I try to help as much as I can." Her words painted a picture of a life filled with struggle, resilience, and quiet determination. Every hardship, every small act of responsibility, had shaped her into someone with an unshakable moral compass. Alexander's mind raced. He had always believed in helping people, in charity, in philanthropy, but usually from a distance. He wrote checks, funded projects, and supported causes. But this was different. This was immediate, tangible, human. It was a connection he could see, touch, and influence directly. He studied her face carefully, noticing the faint bruises on her knees, the dirt under her nails, the way her worn shoes were slightly too big. Every detail told a story of struggle, of sacrifice, and of resilience. And yet, despite all that, she had acted with honesty and bravery, without hesitation. Alexander realized that life had already taught her lessons he hadn't yet learned himself, lessons about courage, humility, and integrity. "Your grandmother raised you well," he said softly. "She must be very proud of you." Lena nodded, a small smile breaking across her face. For the first time, Alexander saw a glimpse of hope in her eyes, a spark that went beyond poverty, hardship, or struggle. It was a spark that reminded him of the human potential for courage, integrity, and kindness. He felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over him. This wasn't just about a wallet or a fleeting encounter. It was about recognizing someone's worth, someone's potential, and someone's courage. He knew that if he walked away, this moment would pass, and both of their lives would remain the same. But if he acted, even in a small way, he could change the course of Lena's life, and in return, she would change his perspective on wealth, success, and humanity. For a few quiet moments, they stood there, the city moving around them, oblivious to the profound connection forming on that street. Alexander realized something important. Life wasn't just about power or possessions, it was about the moments, the people, and the choices that defined who you truly were. And Lena, in all her honesty, bravery, and simplicity, had already begun to teach him what it meant to be truly human. Alexander Hale stood there for a long moment, watching Lena fidget slightly with her hands, her eyes honest and steady. He could feel the weight of the encounter pressing on him, heavier than any business meeting, negotiation, or press conference he had ever attended. In that instant, he realized something profound. Life had just presented him with a choice, a moment that could define not just Lena's future, but his own as well. The wallet had been returned, yes, but it was the girl herself who had given him the real gift, perspective. For years, Alexander had measured success in numbers, profits, properties, and power. He had believed that money could solve problems, that wealth could create influence, and that status could command respect. But all of that seemed trivial now. Here was a child, facing the hardships of poverty, yet her heart, her honesty, and her courage were richer than anything he owned. In that moment, Alexander knew he couldn't simply walk away and resume his life as though nothing had happened. The crowd around them continued to whisper, cameras clicking, but Alexander barely noticed. He wasn't thinking about public appearances, headlines, or social media. All that mattered was the small girl standing in front of him, a child who had risked everything to do the right thing. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he had the power to make a real difference in her life. He bent slightly, lowering his voice so only Lena could hear. "You've done something remarkable today," he said. "But I want you to know that your courage and honesty shouldn't just be recognized, they should be supported." Lena blinked, unsure what he meant. "Supported," she repeated quietly, curiosity and confusion mixing in her eyes. "Yes," Alexander replied, a new determination rising in his chest. "I can't ignore this. You've shown me something that no amount of money could ever teach. You've reminded me of what truly matters. And I want to help you and your grandmother, not just for today, but for the future." Lena's eyes widened, disbelief written across her small face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Alexander smiled gently, sensing the mix of hope and skepticism. He had seen this look before in people who had learned to survive hardship without expecting anything from the world. "I want to offer you opportunities," he continued. "Education, stability, guidance, things that can change your life. Not charity, not temporary handouts, but a real chance to build something meaningful." His voice carried both sincerity and authority, the kind that came from someone used to creating impact and getting results. But this time, the results wouldn't be measured in profits, they would be measured in a life transformed. He glanced around briefly at the crowd, then back at Lena. "It's up to you whether you accept," he said. "I can't force anything. But I promise you this, the honesty, courage, and integrity you showed today are rare. And they deserve to be nurtured, not ignored." Lena hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope, pride, and uncertainty. The tension in the air seemed to melt away as Alexander reached out, not as a billionaire commanding attention, but as a man offering trust, guidance, and the possibility of change. For Alexander, the decision was immediate. He could continue his life of business, meetings, and polished appearances, or he could seize this moment, act decisively, and invest in something far more important than any deal, a human life. He chose the latter, knowing that this choice would be remembered not in bank statements, but in the story of a life transformed. He motioned to one of his assistants to arrange a meeting with Lena and her grandmother. "We'll make sure you have everything you need," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "But more importantly, I want you to know that your actions today changed how I see the world." As the assistant stepped forward to take notes and organize the plan, Alexander allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt something deeper than accomplishment or wealth. He felt purpose. This encounter, brief though it was, had reminded him that true impact wasn't measured in money or power. It was measured in courage, honesty, and the choices we make when we have the opportunity to change someone's life. The city moved around them, oblivious to the quiet transformation taking place on the street. But for Alexander and Lena, the moment was monumental. 5 seconds of courage, honesty, and action had led to a decision that would ripple through both of their lives forever. The billionaire had made a choice, and in doing so, he had begun a journey that neither wealth nor fame could have ever prepared him for, one where real human connection, integrity, and kindness would finally take center stage. The weeks that followed were quiet yet transformative. Alexander Hale returned to his towering offices, his cars gleaming in the sunlight outside, his life seemingly unchanged to the outside world. But inside, everything had shifted. That 5-second encounter with Lena, a child who had nothing but honesty and courage, had left a mark deeper than any business deal, deeper than any success he had ever achieved. He realized that life's true value was measured not by wealth or possessions, but by the choices we make and the lives we touch. Lena's life began to change in ways she could never have imagined. Alexander arranged for her and her grandmother to have a safe, comfortable home, and more importantly, he offered Lena access to education, mentorship, and opportunities that had always been out of reach. For the first time in her life, Lena didn't have to worry about where her next meal would come from, whether her clothes were suitable for school, or if her grandmother could make ends meet. Yet, even with the sudden shift in her circumstances, she remained grounded, humble, and determined to maintain the values that had caught Alexander's attention in the first place. Alexander visited her often, not as a distant benefactor, but as a mentor, a guide, and someone genuinely invested in her growth. He was fascinated by her curiosity, her intelligence, and her unshakable sense of right and wrong. Each visit reminded him of the extraordinary courage and integrity that could exist even in the humblest of places. Lena, in turn, learned to navigate new opportunities with confidence and wisdom, her life slowly opening up like a flower in sunlight. For Alexander, the encounter with Lena had a ripple effect far beyond the two of them. He began to view his wealth differently. The flashy cars, the polished suits, the media attention, they were no longer symbols of achievement, they were tools, resources to empower others. He started initiatives aimed not just at charity, but at creating lasting change, giving opportunities to those who showed integrity, courage, or talent, regardless of their background. The city noticed the shift in him, and soon his influence began to extend not just through business, but through acts of human connection and mentorship. The 5 seconds on that busy street had also transformed Alexander internally. He felt more grounded, more human, and more aware of the power of small actions. He realized that life often presented unexpected moments that could teach lessons money never could. That realization stayed with him, quietly guiding decisions in boardrooms, offices, and even casual encounters. Every time he encountered someone showing honesty or courage, he felt a spark of recognition and gratitude for the lesson Lena had taught him. As for Lena, her transformation was both subtle and profound. She continued to grow into a young woman of intelligence, compassion, and ambition, never forgetting the lessons of humility and integrity that shaped her character. Alexander often reflected on the irony: she had almost nothing, yet she had given him the most important gift of all, a reminder of what it truly meant to be human. Their bond was no longer defined by wealth or status, but by mutual respect, admiration, and the understanding that true impact comes from choices, not possessions. News outlets eventually reported the story, a billionaire humbled by the honesty of a poor child. But the headlines never captured the real essence of what had happened. It wasn't about wealth, fame, or sensationalism. It was about a brief encounter that changed two lives forever, a child teaching a man the value of integrity, and a man giving a child the opportunities to reach her potential. The world could see the headline, but only those who experienced it understood the depth of its meaning. Years later, Alexander would recall that day on the street as a pivotal moment, a reminder that even 5 seconds could shift the course of life. That brief, unplanned encounter reminded him that wealth and power are fleeting, but courage, honesty, and integrity are timeless. Lena's small hand had tugged at his sleeve, and in doing so, it had tugged at the very core of his soul, reminding him that life's true riches are measured not by what you possess, but by how you impact the world around you. And so, the billionaire who once measured life in numbers learned to measure it in moments, choices, and human connections. 5 seconds had changed everything. One small act of honesty had altered a life and, in turn, transformed a man. The story didn't end on the street, it continued every day in the lives they touched, proving that even in a world obsessed with wealth and success, integrity, courage, and compassion remain the most powerful forces of all.